guys to think about with ancient Rome is they are somewhat infatuated by all things Greek. And so what they do with that is they just take it over. So the Greeks had all these issues with Alexander the Great, those wars. They're vulnerable when Alexander the Great falls, and it's not too long after that that the Romans come over and say, hey, we're going to take over Greece. In fact, we're going to go and follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great and take over a lot of the places that he took over. But the Romans had to start somewhere. And so they start out around 600 BCE in central Italy, not too far from the coast. And so they're right over here. But I want you to notice in here, we're looking at Rome up here in this inset. They were not close to the sea. Well, if you're going to try to be an empire, you really need to be close to the sea. See this word Ostia right here? They build a huge seaport there where they discover they can't live by the river that goes through Rome. 2 rivers that go through Rome. And so they're going to have to do some engineering. And so that's the main thing that I want you to know about the Romans. Write this down in big letters. Roman engineering was amazing. And they were able to do things that nobody else had been able to do. And many of the things that they did do, that they developed over time in their engineering, is stuff we do in our societies today. So they did great roads, and the roads, they made their roads very similar to the way that we make our roads. So they made it so that the middle of the road is high and the water rolls off into ditches on the side and sends those out to basically sewer water to get them out of the way. They did water handling, and they did water handling in a way that made sure that even though it was traveling 40 miles through aqueducts, that they're getting rid of dust and debris and making sure the water is as clean as possible. And that does bring us to something they didn't do, which they just didn't have the technology for it at the time. They didn't have sewers quite like we do. We send our sewers to treat, but almost all ancient peoples did not have the capacity, the chemical knowledge to treat, the technical knowledge to aerate the water, etc. And so they put their waste right back into the rivers. And that meant that all the local rivers near a city were contaminated with human waste. They were great sources of cholera and other gastrointestinal diseases. And so they needed to get their water from mountains where there weren't large populations of people contaminating the water. And to do that, they had to build these amazing aqueducts. So in terms of engineering, they're really amazing. But the other big thing I want you to know about them, as much as engineering mattered to them, they were not at all like the Greeks. Now, the Greeks did lots of building, and they built large things, but they built it with post-Atlantic architecture. They built it using the shape of the land itself, and they didn't have significant innovations in the way they built anything, unlike the Romans. But what they did have an innovation in was this idea that the artist, the philosopher, the musician could become a celebrity. They could become famous. And people wanted to know information about them, and they wanted to know their name. So we have the names of lots of artists in the ancient Greek world. And then we get to Rome, and the names disappear. Because in Rome, those artists just weren't important. They were a class of people called artisans, and they made stuff, but you didn't need to know their name. And in fact, a lot of the stuff would be based on Greek stuff, so it'd be copies and reinterpretations of the Greek stuff. Okay, so I want you to think about how Rome is going to start right here, and it's going to drive off its kings. It doesn't have Roman kings, it has Etruscan kings. And these Etruscan kings, they consider them oppressive, and they're not honoring the Romans enough. So they kind of get rid of them all. And then they start taking over more and more of the Italian peninsula. There are Greek colonies down here in Sicily and in the Boot, right here of Italy, and they're going to take those over until eventually they're going to have not just all of this land is part of Italy, but they're going to be spreading out. They're going to go over down here in Croatia. They're going to go through Greece. They're going to head towards Pergamon. They're going to go up to France, Spain, England, and all along the Mediterranean Sea. They're taking over vast territories over time. One of the ways that they succeeded that is they have two things going for them. They have engineering and they have bureaucracies. We hear a lot of negativity about bureaucracies, but Rome wouldn't have been Rome without its massive bureaucracy. So we're going to start by looking at a sculpture that was made at this transition period between when the Romans have full power and the Etruscans have completely lost power. And so we're looking at an Etruscan citizen. He's a high status citizen. The sculpture is made of him in bronze. We can see that kind of greenish gray color is the color of old bronze that's oxidized. And he has his hand out like this. And we can see that his knee is bent. He's got what kind of pose?
Heroic.
No, archaic is a style. So we're looking at a pose. This is a pose we saw a lot in Greek art, starting with the classical.
Was it contrapost?
Contrapposto. So he's got his knee bent, or that's going to cause tilting on the shoulders, twist in the spine to try to make it all even and balance out. So he's got that pose. His knee is a little bent, not completely. And he has his hand out there. The hand gesture means I speak and you listen. He's Etruscan, but he's wearing a Roman toga. He's being incorporated into Roman society. What happened to the Etruscans? They became Romans. He had inlaid eyes, but they're gone. And notice the short hair. That was very popular. Okay. So now we're going to talk briefly about a kind of Etruscan temple. And so we've seen what Greek temples look like. And Greek temples have, remember, these three-step platforms. And they're basically stairs all the way around the building. And the columns, mean there's so many that you can't really see where you're supposed to go in, because you're not supposed to go in. So that would be a Greek temple. So what the Etruscans do for their temples is they are influenced. They're trading with the Greeks, they're influenced by them, but they're not Greeks. So they're going to say, yeah, we don't do that whole thing here where we have steps all the way around, waste of resources. And we actually want people to know where to find the priest. So we're going to build our steps right here. And so we can see looking here. This is not an Etruscan temple. This is a Roman temple. But you can see, oh, they put the steps right in the front to say, this is where you go up and in. Notice this open area? We saw that open area on the Greek temples. This is where you would go stand and talk to the priest. You're invited in with those stairs instead of kept out like the Greek temples. Okay, so the next thing I want you to notice is there's something weird going on with the columns. So I want you guys to look at the columns and see that some are one way and some are another, and so to figure out what those ways are. Now we do have this as one of our vocabulary words.
The columns around the outside are cut in half, and they're more like decoration instead of something that would actually be supporting the structure.
So these are freestanding columns up here, and these are what we call engaged columns. Now, engaged columns are not columns at all. They just kind of look like it on the outside. They're blocks that make up the wall. They're like big stone blocks. And they just cut them to have the bulge out area to make the column. And then they go ahead and carve it to have the ribs. The other thing is that in their appreciation of Greek temples and Greek culture and Greek art, they really liked those marble and light limestone buildings that the Greeks were making for their temples. But they don't actually have large amounts of marble available to them, unlike the Greeks. So they're going to have to use other kinds of building materials, including compressed volcanic ash, which is not going to give you the pretty, smooth, and decorative surface that you might like if you were trying to do marble. But we can fix it by painting it white with a lime paint. So lime is where you take limestone and you basically burn it at a high enough temperature and you convert it to this white powder. Then you add water and you paint it on the stuff. Okay, do I have anybody here who's in interior design? Interior design people, you may know that like right now it's like this period of like line washes that people are putting on their interiors. And it's supposed to be a little more textural, a little bit more kind of contrasty than just straight paint. Its roots go all the way back to here. Isn't that pretty cool? Okay, so this is called the Temple of Portunus, and that means this is the god of ports. And ports, of course, are where people bring things to put on the ships to send off for sale elsewhere, and where also wealth comes in the form of goods from these ships, as well as money from trade that's done overseas. And so people are coming in and out of this little temple a lot because they're praying to Portunus to make sure their ship arrives safely at its destination. And remember when we were looking at the Greek sculpture, and I said that this one was found off Riace, and this one was also found off the sea. They had reason to need to pray for help because a lot of ships would get lost if they weren't going at the right time of year. So this one's going to be significant. We've got the steps in the front, we've got a different kind of foundation, but it is still a quote of the Greek form, and we got the engaged columns. Okay, so this one's kind of interesting. This is the temple of Vesta. She is the goddess Vesta who is in charge of the Vestal Virgins. And she is responsible for kind of making sure that all remains pure, appropriate, and good in the rites that are conducted in the city of Rome and for all of the Roman Empire. And so Vesta would basically go and collect girls when they were around 10 or 11 years old. And then they would be initiated into the cult of the Vestal Virgins. And they'd need to stay there until they were about 38 or 39, at which point they could leave and go and be independent women. But they had to stay virginal. If they weren't virginal, they were put to death. And it was considered a terrible uncleanliness, not just on the Vestal Virgins, but on all of Rome, because this might have happened. So pretty brutal. What's interesting is that this temple is unlike any other temple that had been made. This thing was round, not rectangular. And you can see from what's left of it that they're building it kind of in a Greek style. And the Greeks did have some round structures. They weren't buildings though. And they made them kind of in the end of the classical era, beginning of the Hellenistic era. And they were tombs made in that round form. And so the Romans have taken that round form and they've reinterpreted it into this really important temple for the Vestal Virgins. Now, do any of you recognize the actual kind of columns these are?
Well, it's not the scrolls of Ionian, so it's Corinthian, or?
It's not even Corinthian. They're making up their own new styles based on the Greek styles. Okay, so we're in the Republican period, and once the Romans kill the kings of the Etruscans, they decide that they are not going to have any power amassed by one person. They say that's dangerous. That's what we had with the Etruscan kings. They caused so much trouble for us. So we're going to have a senate, And Senate has the first, the prefix of the word Senate is also the same one for senior. Or do I have any seniors in class? I mean, it's great. Congratulations, that's awesome. So seniors, wise elders, knowledgeable and skilled. So that's why they wanted senators. They want them to be wise elders who know how to get things done and make it happen. And so they also have two consuls, and the consuls are like governors. And then they have this one little thing that they left open. They said, in case there's ever a crisis where our senators can't solve things, we're going to have a dictator. He who speaks and basically says this is the way things must be done. And they said they should use this rarely because it was so dangerous to have a dictator. But then they kind of made Julius Caesar a dictator. And that didn't end well for Julius Caesar or for Rome because his nephew then took over and became the first emperor. And the Senate wasn't abolished, it just became essentially powerless. So we're still back in the Republican phase. Check this guy out. Think of all the stone sculptures we've seen from Greece and also from Egypt. And check this out. Does he look like any of them? What do you notice about it? He has wrinkles. He has jowls. He has resting, cranky old man face. Do you notice anything about his ears? They do, yes, they are. You know why, anybody?
Your ears continue to grow as you age.
Basically, the connective tissue collapses and your ears stretch. So I have big ears now. It's gonna happen to you guys. It happens a little bit to your nose too, so your nose will get bigger. You guys are really excited about that. Then check out his eyebrows. He's got the furry, twisty hairs eyebrows of your grandparents. He's a senator. And why does he look like that? This is called an imagine. Hard to spell, right? It's the word imagine. And this is the image of a wise man. A senator, a senior. No youthful young people in their ideal form like the Greeks like to do. They want a sculpture of a wise old guy. This one's a priest, and so he has his toga. Togas are like long. They could be up to like 8 yards long of woolen cloth. And to wrap these around yourself appropriately without having to pin it and not let them touch the ground was an art that young men in the senator class were taught how to do, how to handle all that cloth with no pin. If you wore a pin to hold your toga up, you would be ridiculed. And so he has to flip part of it up to be over his head to put him in a state of kind of cleanliness in order to do the rites that he's involved in. So, he's also dead. Now you could guess that he's dead, but he was dead when they made the sculpture. So what the imagines are wax masks that were made right after a man who was head of an extended family with an elaborate household who was like a senator, an aristocratic man would die, and his son would immediately call, or if he didn't have a son, his son-in-law would immediately call for the wax workers to come and make a mask of his face. And his face would be preserved in this reverse version of him as the wax was pulled off when it cooled. And sometimes they'd go ahead and adapt it to make it look like his eyes are open. And over time, so they would take these and they have this nice little cupboard that they had kind of in their entry room, like our living room for most of us. And in here they would store the wax masks of their important male ancestors. But then they get all of this beautiful sculpture coming over from Greece. And some of the wealthy senatorial class families are like, hey, why don't we hire an artist to look at the mask and carve Uncle? And so that's what we've got going on here. This is very different from the idealism of the classical style in Greece or the emotional component and the dramatic component of the Hellenistic style in Greece. This style is called Verism, Verism, and Verism means truth, truthfulness, a true visage of a wise man. All right, now we're going to pop over to Pompeii. So we are looking at Pompeii here for its architecture and for its beautiful paintings that got left behind because of the explosion of Mount Vesuvius. What we're looking at here in this picture is we're seeing houses out here, and then this is called the Forum. So this would be where there was a huge temple. There would be kind of a big place to trade goods, a big marketplace that would be open sometimes once a week, sometimes every day, but people could come in and out of it anyway. And you would also have a basilica, which is a law court. And so this was the place, if you were wanting to know what was going on in the community, you would want to go here and find out what all the gossip was, what was happening in the world. And it's preserved so well because of their engineering, but also because of the fact that Vesuvius blew up and it sent down a pyroclastic cloud with a lot of debris that killed a lot of people, and then it smothered them under ash. For a long time, it was thought that most of the people must have escaped. But then in the 19th century, as archaeologists were working on excavating Pompeii, they would find these holes in the ash layer that they were excavating. And so one of them got the idea, what if we mix up some plaster and pour it in the hole and see what we find? And what they found were human and animal bodies that had completely gone away, leaving the hole.
Oh, yeah. I always thought they were just like petrified from the heat, so that's cool to know.
A lot of the people that escaped, there were ships lined up out at sea waiting to take people out of the area, but the pyroclastic cloud became so dangerous that the ships couldn't come in to evacuate any more people. So, particularly in the town of Hellenium, they found hundreds of bodies waiting down by the docks, waiting for the ships. I know it's really pathetic of me, but one of the ones that always gets me the most is the dog. The dog always gets me. Okay, so let's take a look at this innovation that they come up with their knowledge of engineering. So they take a look at Greek theaters, and if you remember, a Greek theater is a semicircle, and it's built into a hillside so you can have those nice step-down seats so everybody gets a clear view of what's happening down on the stage. They have to have the hill. The Greeks do not have the technology or the interest in figuring out how to build a theater with the step-down seats without a hill. The Romans look at that and they're like, hey, we can build that faster and easier, but we don't have to just find the right hill, we can just build it. And so we're looking here at their amphitheater, and we're looking at how they did it. They basically built a strong wall all the way around that's very high, and they fill it with these arches. These arches are the key to absolutely everything that they came up with. Now this is a wall painting from a house showing us a terrible scene that happened in Pompeii, where basically they're having battles in the amphitheater between these competitors from two different cities. And the fight breaks out on the streets outside. And it's terrible. A lot of people get killed and injured. And the Romans are so, or the Pompeian citizens are so upset that basically they stopped using the amphitheater for 10 years because people's behavior made them ban it. So here we can see what they do on that exterior wall. They fill it with these arches. Now, arches are amazing. The Etruscans are the ones who invented arches, but they didn't do a lot with the arch. So let's look at what you can do with an arch. Now, when you do regular post and lintel architecture, which we have right over here, I'm stepping under the lintel. I'm protected by the posts right here. But in the old days, these are not fastened in very well. The Greeks would have iron pegs in there to hold it. We basically have the same thing, but they're more and better. But the Romans said, no, we don't do that. We're gonna build an arch. So when we have post and lintel architecture, we have gravity here coming down, and anything that hits the posts or damages the post is gonna make this fall. So not terribly stable, but stable enough for most things. But the Etruscans had come up with the arch and the Romans ran with it. And so what they would do is they would make the arch, and to make it, they would take something called a centering post. And they would make a shape out of wood that's just the size they needed to be. And on top of that, they would first put stones down here to make their uprights, their posts. And then they'd start putting in stones. And these stones need to be cut on the diagonal a little bit in order to get them to fit. And you got this. This is made out of wood. It's holding the whole thing up. So you build up on this side, you build up on this side, and then finally you put this one in. This one's called a keystone. And it locks the arch into place. So now it's the pressure of the shapes pushing against each other. It's much harder for them to break loose and fall. When you put them together, they're pushing against each other. And so that makes them extra resilient. Now let's take an arch in our minds. Everybody looking at me? Got an arch in your mind. Move the arch horizontally, as long as you want. And we get a barrel vault. Now if we look at the barrel vault, we can see this is where the keystone would be. This is where the arch is coming down and meeting the wall. Look, it's thickened up to make it nice and supportive. There are no windows in here. It's gonna be dark. Leave me alone. Okay, so what if we take two of these barrel vaults and we intersect like that? We now get what we call a groin vault. Groin vaults are also called cross vaults because they make a cross shape. So because they intersect each other, they let in light on all four sides. So they're filled with light. All the weight, all the pressure is coming down here. They're reinforcing each other. It's very hard for them to fall. So they're very resilient. Now you take that idea and say, hey, how can we make it more elaborate? What if we have basically a barrel vault with cross vaults down here, and then a really tall central vault with cross vaults on top? Look at all the light and height we can get into the building, and therefore all the relatively open space we can have in there. And then finally, we take a beautiful, lovely arch. Imagine 143 feet high and across. You take your arch and you spin it on its axis, 360 degrees, and you get a dome. Pretty amazing. And then they do something else. They've got all this ash, and they've got limestone, which they can burn and turn into lime. They're even going to make something that no one had created before, cement. And cement means that you can now go ahead and design a structure and pour the concrete in to make it. You don't have to just build it with blocks. The concrete's going to stick to itself. So you have essentially solid buildings. So we are looking here at an example of kind of a merchant or senatorial class family's house in Pompeii. And this one shows us that they've got this entryway, we can see it right here, and notice it's almost like Chateau Bouillon. We don't see windows and doors along here, except at this entrance. Sometimes they put an entrance here at the back, and they would share often a wall with their neighbors. So they're enclosed, and cultures that have kind of descended from the Roman Empire tends to like to have fences around their gardens and walls. That is really important to help you feel safe. But once we get inside, we do have natural light coming in. It's coming in through these openings in the roof. This one creates something called an atrium. That's number 3 right here. Remember I told you about the little cupboard where they stored the wax and marble heads? That's going to be like right over here. So let's enter into this building. And we're just walking through the front entrance right now. And I want you to notice that we are in an atrium. So an atrium has this opening in the roof, and it gives you a little pool down here. They're collecting the rainwater off the roof. There's going to be a dry season, no rain. So they're going to want to collect some water and keep it. But they've also got little gutters that are channeling the water into this pool. Now, if you leave the door open, that entry door open, the breeze can come in, it can go out through the opening here in the ceiling and out here in the garden. So air can move, and it's going to go across that water in the dry season, and it's going to humidify it and cool it off. This is what they did for air conditioning. Okay, so now we're looking at something that they did to decorate their buildings in Pompeii. And we're assuming a lot of these are similar to what they had in Rome. The problem with the city of Rome and our excavations of it for the last few hundred years is that it has an actual living city on top of it, on top of all these Roman ruins, all these medieval ruins. And so a lot of them are kind of hard to get to, hard to excavate. So it was much easier to do this in an abandoned city covered with ash. So we're looking at how people decorated the walls of their house. This is a Samnite house, so that would have been from, I think, northern Italy. So it's a style coming from northern Italy. And they painted it to look like panels of wood and panels of stone that were put up on a wall to decorate it in all of these different colors. But it's all just a fresco. There's not really stone up there. There's not really wood panels. It's just a fresco. Okay, now we're looking at another one of these houses. And this one has what's called the Dionysiac Mystery Frieze in it. And I'm just showing you part of it. The whole room was painted basically with this kind of scene with a ground line where you have a single register where a narrative is taking place. And that is the Dionysian mystery cult rites that are happening here. Should I turn the lights down so you can see it better? Wrong direction. Okay, so this would have been a mystery cult. And a mystery cult was something that was used in ancient Greece as a way to figure out the afterlife. Like, what do we do in the afterlife? What happens to us in the afterlife? This consciousness that we have, what do we do with it? Is it just dead? Is it just down there in the darkness and fog of Hades? And so what do we do? So some people began to follow specific deities, Greek deities for the most part, who died and came back to life. And so we've already talked, when we were talking about ancient Crete and Minoan culture, we talked about how we have got these deities who lived and died. So we've got Dionysus, and we can actually see Dionysus right here. He's got the staff that he leads by. He's got a toga over his lap, but we can see that he's an indulgent god. He's what we call sybaritic. He has orgies, he has parties, he gets drunk, and he's lounged in what appears to not be a fully upright state. And a lot of it has been lost right here, unfortunately, but he's holding something up, and we suspect what he's holding up in the higher hand are grapes, and then he's got wine in the other hand. Those were his kind of symbols that he had. He usually wore a crown that we can barely see with some green right here. It's like grape leaves. And remember, he, like the grapevines, would die off. So he died every winter, and then he was reborn. So this is a cult dedicated to him, and young women especially would join this cult, and they would marry him symbolically.
Hmm.
And as part of that ceremony, you had to be initiated. And to be initiated, you had to be whipped. And so what we see here is he's looking in this direction. He's watching this young woman be whipped. She's being initiated. The person whipping her is this female winged figure who has a whip in her hand, and she is getting ready to beat this woman on the back, and the woman is hunched over another older woman's lap. Now this one's gruesome enough and sexy enough that I really want to see it in your notes. Okay, other wall paintings that they liked to do. They loved to paint architecture inside architecture. So this is a cubiculum. So this is like a bedroom. And the cubiculum has all these lovely paintings of buildings. And here is a detail of one of them. Notice this is like a round temple. That's like the Temple of Vesta. And that we have other buildings, grand public buildings that are made in the Greek style, going down the side. And notice, if you will, we have linear perspective happening here. They've got a vanishing point. So if we come in like this, we're going to find the vanishing point's about right here. That means that they have developed the skill to create a realistic looking representational space that looks a lot like our eyes and brains looking into the distance and how we understand that. That is hard to do. Not that many cultures came up with that kind of solution, but they did. This one is a fresco from the Villa of Livius. She was the wife of Augustus, the nephew of Julius Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. And she decided that in this room that has no windows, she would like to look out at her garden. And so there it is. The top of it has been lost and destroyed, but this is what remained. And they got so into their architecture, so driven by fashion. And don't forget that fashion is really important. So for my interior design people, I want you guys to think about green, that nice dark shade of green. And a couple of years ago, it wasn't the dark shade of green that was popular. It was kind of a sage green that was really popular. These colors come and go under fashion. And so we see that buildings, just like people, reflect changing ideas about ideal fashion. And so they've taken the whole idea of buildings that we saw that were looking pretty naturalistic, pretty realistic, and they've turned those buildings into this. It looks like it's just a piece of jewelry almost, like it's made out of gold. It's impossible to see, so you'll have to take my word for it. See this little floating design here in the middle? That's a building with trees all the way around it. Just this tiny little building in the middle of the wall, floating in the middle of black space, surrounded by a gold framework of a temple. And then they decide to make windows. They're paintings on the wall that look like windows in architectural spaces. Some of the things they like to do are highlights and shadows. And the Romans were the first mass producers of glass. And here they're showing us they know how to paint glass in a convincing way. They're borrowing that Greek drive towards naturalism. All right, and so the Roman Republican style, which is everything we saw at Pompeii, comes to an end. And it comes to an end with this guy. This is Augustus Caesar. This sculpture is made possibly after his death, kind of as a heroic Greek style figure honoring the dead guy. Or maybe it was before he was dead. We don't have literature from the time telling us about it. It was found in Livia's villa, though. It had its own little arched nook that it was in the wall. And if you look at it from behind, it's not as well carved. It's meant to be looked at from the front. And notice that, does he look like a veristic senator?
No.
No way he looks like a veristic senator. He's idealized. In fact, we think that when it was made, he was about 16 years old. There's no way he's gonna look like a 30-year-old. He has some cool stuff on it for symbolism. First thing I hope you notice is this. This is Cupid, right here, by my finger. Valentine's Day is almost here, so it's perfect timing. Okay, Cupid is the child of Venus and Mars, the god of war and the goddess of love. And the patron deity of ancient Troy. So remember the competition and battle between the Trojans and the Greeks that went on for 10 years? How the Romans claimed that they were descended from Trojans. He's claiming he's descended directly from Venus, and as a result of being directly descended from Venus, he is being supported and encouraged on his marble leg, not by a tree trunk, but by
Cupid.
cousin, uncle, I'm not even sure how we calculate that, but there he is, a relative of Cupid's. And notice the pose that he's in. We just saw that at the beginning of class. What was that called?
Contrapposto.
It has contrapposto, that's the stance, but what was the figure called?
Hold on.
It's the oringatory gesture. We're gonna see it again, because now he's not meeting all the people and talking to them. He's talking to his military troops. Notice he's dressed in armor, war regalia. He's holding his toga carelessly wrapped around himself in his arm and looks quite elegant with it. And he has here a Greek-style sculpture on his chest armor that shows that he has gotten back something that had been lost in a battle, which were the standards of the Romans. And he gets them back. He says he's the great peacemaker. And he puts this on his chest to show people and remind them that he's divine, because he's got Cupid right there. Talk about propaganda. Very different from what we would have seen in the Roman Republic. Okay, so now I am going to show you this cutie. Here is Livia. And so we start seeing these lovely, smooth, Greek-style sculptures of men and women. Now, Augustus has a bit of an issue. He's been involved in a lot of wars, and he might have a problem getting enough soldiers. Because if you're in enough wars, you lose your soldiers. He's lost a lot of soldiers. He needs more. And people keep not having children. They have abortions. They lose children and stop trying. They have an incredibly high infant mortality rate. They actually live on these little hills surrounded by flatlands where the rivers flood out. So all that waste is going into the marshes around the city. And so basically we have malaria attacking the citizens of Rome. Oh, and don't forget the lead pipes. So, yeah, they've got some issues that they're dealing with. One of the things that they did is they added something to the water that acidified it to help clean it up. And that means that it was able to leach out more of the lead into the drinking supply. So he needs to build up the number of people that he has, and he also needs to show how grand and great he is. So we've got a real drive for propaganda. We already saw that with his sculpture of the Augustus of Prima Porta. So here he is. He decides to build a permanent altar to peace, which is called Pax, P-A-X. And he's saying, I have brought Rome peace. So he makes this, and then he has a huge parade through the city. Everybody's invited to come. They slaughter all of these bulls and hogs for the ceremony to make their sacrifices. And then he gets to go up these steps inside to actually pray. He is a priest. Augustus means he's like the highest level of priest. So he gets to not just be the dictator, the emperor, he gets to be a priest as well. And we see all this decoration on the front and the sides, and it tells us about the soldier problem. And you can imagine that if you don't have enough males, it's going to take you a while to build up your male population. And in general, male infants are going to die at a slightly higher rate than female infants. So they've got a problem. But don't worry. It turns out that when you have a drop in the number of babies of either sex, that people start having sex more often, and that means that women are getting pregnant earlier in their cycle, which tends to have a very slight benefit for males. Babies slightly more likely to be male and slightly able to make up for that. Doesn't work so well for replacing girls. So cultures that practice highly valuing male children and really repressing female children find that suddenly they don't have enough adult women. And that's a crisis as well, but a different one. So here we are, we've got the parade of all the aristocrats, and they are going to this great feast. And notice that something that had never been in the sculpture before were kids. And now they're all over this thing. They're like, kids are great. Kids are really good. And we're showing that we have kids. We, the aristocrats, have lots of kids. And they're surviving, and it's good. Augustus passed some laws. One of them was that if you had like 3 kids, that you would get a certain amount of food for free just to have the kids to help you pay for the cost of children. Another thing was that if you were a woman who had 5 children, that you basically never had to pay taxes again in your life, which is pretty good incentive to have 5 kids. But it didn't work that well, because trying to raise the birth rate for exterior reasons tends not to work terribly well. Okay. So that's what's going on. This is called the Areopagus Augusti, and it's this outdoor shrine, this outdoor sacrificial space filled with propaganda. All right, I'm going to have us stop there, and I'm going to have you show me your notes as you leave